Thanks for joining me in today's video Bible study. My name is Ryan Goodwin. I preach for the East Shelby Church of Christ in Collierville, Tennessee. If you have any questions or comments about what we studied today, then please leave them in the comments section below. Or if you'd like to learn more about our congregation, you can find us at eastshelby.com. We've been going through the book of Ecclesiastes lately, so if you have your Bibles handy, open up to the Old Testament, and a little over halfway through you'll find Ecclesiastes. We'll begin in chapter 4 and verse 1. The text says, "Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them." So Solomon, the presumed writer of Ecclesiastes, has been exploring the idea of meaning and purpose in life under the sun. That's the term that he typically uses to describe life on planet Earth. That if you take God out of the picture and just based on everything you can observe around you, life under the sun, is there something worth living for here? Is there some greater purpose, some lasting contentment and happiness to be found? And he's tried wealth and possessions. He's tried accomplishments and monuments. He's even tried wisdom and intellectual pursuits. And everything has left him with the same conclusion. Vanity of vanities, all of life is vanity. So now he turns his attention in chapter 4 to something bigger than just the individual, bigger than just himself. Society, civilization, government, human relationships. Is there some higher meaning, some grand purpose to be found in the way that people interact with each other when we become a part of something bigger than ourselves? Is that where ultimate purpose is going to be found? And right away, he's disappointed with what he finds. He says here in chapter 4 and verse 1, "All I saw was oppression." It was injustice. It was unfairness. Power rested with the oppressors. And it was only loneliness, alienation, discouragement to the oppressed. Now, Solomon's not just talking about his own civilization here, because you can see this even today. For as much as we've advanced in technology and in our institutions and in our languages, as much as we've advanced, oppression still exists today. There are still people oppressed. Power still rests with the oppressors, and there is nobody found to comfort those who are oppressed. And so one writer put it really well in a book called Explore the Book by Baxter. He summed up Solomon's conclusion in chapter 4, verse 1 in the following words. On the other hand, he finds human society disfigured by injustices, inequalities, enigmas, and superficialities. I think that applies to a lot of what he discovers in the rest of chapter 4. That if you're looking to human society, and the term we use for that today is called secular humanism, right? If you take God out of the picture and you assume that there is no God, if you are looking to human accomplishment and human society and what can humans do when we put our minds to it and raise ourselves up by our bootstraps, if you're looking to that for contentment and ultimate purpose and meaning, you're going to end up just as disappointed as Solomon. Because the oppression still exists, and it always will. Even Jesus himself said, "The poor you will have with you always." There are always going to be wars and rumors of wars, according to Matthew chapter 24. There will always be famine. There will always be natural disasters. There will always be people in positions of power who abuse that power. And we have to accept that. Now, the acts of oppression that Solomon talks about here in verse 1 are not merely rude interactions between people. He's not just talking about people being mean to each other on the freeway or saying something nasty at the grocery store. Rather, these are high-handed injustices. This is offensive selfishness. This is the kind of life where you are pursuing not just your own interests, but you are pursuing the destruction of your neighbor's interests as well. And we need to admit that there is injustice all around us. It is unavoidable that greedy people will abuse the humble. As long as there are positions of power to be had, there will be corrupt people to abuse those positions of power. That is a reality. It is a fact. That's how it's always been for all of human history. And as long as there's sin in the world, that's how it will always be. Now, if you don't believe in God, how does that leave you feeling? But if you do believe in God, you understand that there is ultimately an eternal reckoning for these things. Notice in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12, this is in your New Testament. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 12, the writer says here, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testings, though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you." Now, he says in verse 15, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 15, "By no means let any of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not feel ashamed, but in that name let him glorify God." There are a lot of different reasons why somebody might be oppressed. Maybe it's economic oppression, maybe it's oppression based on race or ethnicity or religion. No matter why it is that you're oppressed, we understand that if we have our hope in God, if we put our faith and our trust in God, no matter how much we suffer in this life, no matter how much we're oppressed, no matter how hard or challenging or difficult the fiery ordeal is, we know that ultimately we're going to face God in judgment. And He is a merciful, gracious, and loving God. He is a God who does not forget the oppression. He is a God who does not forget the cry of the widow and of the orphan. He is a God who does not forget every act of personal vengeance taken, every act of abuse, every act of corruption in positions of power. And so we put our trust in God, ultimately. Now, that's the Christian's take on it. That's not necessarily how Solomon was feeling at first when he was observing human society. He goes on to say in verse 2, this is Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 2, "So I congratulated the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still living." But verse 3, "Better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun." Now, if you feel like that's a rather pessimistic view of life, you're right. That's pretty pessimistic, isn't it? I congratulated the dead who are already dead. And again, if secular humanism is your own pursuit, if that's your worldview, if you don't believe in God and you just believe in the power of human civilization, that we can cure every disease and fix every problem and everybody can live this perfect life in a utopia, I think eventually, with the weight of corruption and the weight of civilization and the weight of history, I think eventually you have to come to the same conclusion as Solomon. It just would have been better not to exist at all. I congratulated the dead who are already dead. But you know why? Because the dead who are already dead don't know how horrible coronavirus is. Because the dead who are already dead don't have to worry about the next presidential election, which is always terrible, by the way. It always hurts our society. We always end up arguing with people that we would never normally argue with. Somehow or another, an election brings out the absolute worst in people in America. And so I congratulate the dead who are already dead. The dead who are already dead, they don't have to see what the next horrible thing in the news is going to be, who the next horrible terrorist is going to be, what the next horrible dictator is going to do, what the next horrible pandemic is, what the next terrible earthquake is going to do to human beings. The dead who are already dead, they don't have to see the next piece of bad news. And so Solomon congratulates them. Good for them. They're dead. Better off than everybody, though, is the one who has never even existed. Really? Now, maybe if you don't believe in God, I suppose you could come to that conclusion that if there is no God, it would have been better just not to exist at all than to see the pain and suffering on planet Earth. I mean, in a lifetime, even if you are fortunate enough to live to be 80 or 90 years old, how many of your friends and family members have you buried in that time period? I mean, even simpler than that, how many times have you been hurt or disappointed or hungry or sick? How many pets have you had to lose? How many jobs have you been fired from? How many depressions and recessions and wars have you had to endure or witness? If you don't believe in God, if there is no God, if there is no ultimate purpose beyond just the physical life, it would have been better to never experience this life at all. Now, Solomon is not the only one in the Bible who was tempted to come to that conclusion. Even the prophets of God at times felt the same way. Job, for example, echoes this sentiment in Job chapter 3, verses 11 through 19. Jeremiah the prophet as well. If you go to the Old Testament and notice in Jeremiah chapter 20. In Jeremiah chapter 20, it says in verse 14, "Cursed be the day when I was born. Let the day not be blessed when my mother bore me. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, saying, a baby's been born to you, and made him very happy. But let the man be like the cities which the Lord overthrew without relenting. Let him hear an outcry in the morning and a shout of alarm at noon, because he did not kill me before birth, so that my mother would have been my grave, her womb ever pregnant. Why did I ever come forth from the womb to look on trouble and sorrow, so that my days have been spent in shame?" According to this idea, the dead are blessed because they no longer have to suffer. The living are cursed because all they know is suffering. And it is simply best to have never lived at all. This is congruent with what one Greek philosopher said: better to die than to lead a wretched life. Unfortunately, this view of life is not God's view of life. And we need to conclude that Solomon probably wrote this from the perspective of somebody very disappointed, very disgusted with the things that he was seeing all around him. Seeing things as they are, just looking at the world as it is, with no thought of God, without including God in the great equation of life, that naturally would lead a person to believe in this idea. But when we place God in the picture, we suddenly have hope and faith and perseverance and endurance and love and many more things. These qualities become what makes life valuable. Better off than both of them is the one who has never existed. I guess I just don't buy that. Given what suffering does for us, given the reward that's found in endurance, I just don't find it something that I can believe in. That's just better to have never existed at all. Yeah, life hurts at times. You might even say that life hurts most of the time. There's always something that's gnawing away at us, something that's difficult for us to accept. There's always something out there that's going to bother us, be it a physical thing or something in our relationships or something in the news. There's always something that's going to be bothering us. But if you had never existed in the first place, you never would have learned what it means to endure. You never would have been perfected and shaped and honed by those negative life experiences. The book of James puts it very well in the New Testament. And this is probably a verse that you're familiar with. But in James chapter 1 and verse 2, notice what it says here. "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." If you never exist in the first place, you never learn what it means to be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. What if John the Baptist had never existed? What if Job had never existed? What if Paul the Apostle had never existed? Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Jesus Christ? Lives that are full of suffering and persecution and oppression, those are not meaningless lives. And according to the view that Solomon's putting forward in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, he's saying that they are meaningless lives. A life of suffering and oppression is a life that was never worth living, according to that worldview. And God is trying to tell us differently. Now, we understand, of course, that this is simply one point in Solomon's life. He's explaining that at one point in his life, that is the conclusion that he had come to. At that moment, observing everything around him, it was hard for him to avoid the idea that it would be better to have never existed at all. Now, that's not the final conclusion that Solomon comes to. That's not the end of the story. You have to get to chapter 12 to see where Solomon is going with this. He's simply saying that at the point where I went looking to human society, at that point in my life where I thought I could find meaning and purpose and fulfillment, looking at government, looking at civilization, looking at society and human interaction, at that point in my life, I concluded it was better to have never lived at all. Oh, how wrong that is. Now let's move on and notice another idea here. In verse 4, Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 4, I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. Now we'll hold off on verse 5 for just a second here. It is sad, by the way, that when the only reason that things ever get invented or improved upon is to just beat a competitor. And by the way, history is filled with stories like that. History is filled with stories about the only reason that medicine ever got invented, or that electricity was ever honed the way that it was, or that we took off in an airplane the very first time that we did, right? History is filled with examples where the only reason something ever got invented was because two people were competing with each other, trying to outdo each other. That's kind of sad. Now, it's not sad in the sense of, I'm glad that stuff was invented. I'm glad that we have electricity and we have penicillin and we have light bulbs and that sort of thing. But it's sad that when you're the one doing the inventing, or you're the one pursuing the record, or you're the one climbing the mountain, you're the one trying to be the first one, the greatest one, the most all time, the GOAT, right? When you're the one trying to do that, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it's a hollow life. Think about every world record. Eventually it gets broken, doesn't it? The fastest 100-meter dash, the fastest marathon, the tallest building, the fastest one up to the top of a mountain, the one who goes the highest, the one who goes the lowest, the one who is the richest, whatever it is that is the thing that you're pursuing, eventually somebody's going to beat your record. Records don't stand forever. Buildings don't stand forever. Monuments don't stand forever. And so that's the vanity that he's pointing to. It's not that everything that's invented because of rivalry is a bad thing. Solomon is simply saying this is vanity and striving after the wind. When your life is wrapped up in just rivalry with your neighbor, when the only reason that you're pursuing something is to try and beat somebody else at it, eventually, in that quiet moment of your life when it's just you and your memories and your regrets, when it's just you facing God and the life that you've lived, it's a pretty vain life that you lived. It's pretty vain. We need to be very careful not to get caught up in the intense world of competition, because competition is only good when it motivates us to innovate and to invent. It becomes very bad when it consumes us, though. The vanity of it all is this, that no matter how hard we may try to build the greatest this or the fastest that somebody will always come along and do it better or taller or faster. It is an endless cycle which leaves us unfulfilled when our competitors have left us in the dust. Verse 5. The fool folds his hand and consumes his own flesh. Verse 6. One hand full of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving after the wind. I like this phrase here, the fool folds his hand and consumes his own flesh. This is the same type of person described as the sluggard in Proverbs chapter 24, verses 30 through 34, as well as a few other passages in the book of Proverbs. You notice from Proverbs chapter 24 that, the sluggard is the type of guy that's got the overgrown yard, the overgrown field. It's got thistles and weeds everywhere. His fence is broken down. And the sluggard simply folds his hands and says, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Why? Because instead of working and getting food, getting income, providing for himself and providing for his family, he doesn't work. He just sits back and rests and ends up consuming himself. And after all, in a survival situation, if you don't put food in, where does your body turn for sustenance? To itself, to fat, to muscles, and eventually you die. So what is this phrase then when he says here, one handful of rest is better than two fistful of labor and striving after them? Well, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Now, I think there are two interpretations. Now, many commentators believe this verse to be a common maxim of lazy people that they use in their defense. Essentially, what some commentators say is that the verse is like it's a saying, right? It's a truism for the lazy person. The lazy person sits back and he watches all those people working so hard. Look at them working so hard, using up their lives, toiling for the man. One handful of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving after the wind. So that's one interpretation, is that's kind of like the lazy man's justification for his lifestyle. But I think there's a second interpretation, and this is the one that I tend to go with. I believe that this verse serves as a warning against discontent and the restless pursuit of worldly wealth. Basically, I think the verse is telling us to have some balance in our lives. That it would be better to have one hand full of rest, right? Your life is balanced. You have some rest. Better to have a handful of rest and know when to quit, when to stop working, to know when to go home to your family, to know when to relax, to recuperate, to recover from illness, to know when you've pushed yourself too hard, right? Better to have a handful of rest and know what your limits are than to have two fists full of labor, two fists full of striving, two fists full of work. You're always working, always go, 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 go. Without the balance, what's the point of it all? Why are you working so hard? What's the point of working those 70-hour work weeks just for your family, right? And that's how we always justify it, right? We put in the extra hours, we get the overtime, we take on that extra project, right? What's the point of all of it when we justify it by saying, well, I'm doing it to take care of my family? But what's the point of all those hours worked? What's the point of all that money earned? What is the point of that job if you don't actually spend the time with your family? If you're not actually cultivating relationships with the people that you should be loving the most. Have some balance in your life. Just enough work and competition to keep ourselves clothed and fed and content, but never so much rest and relaxation that we end up starving ourselves and our families to death. So take a look at verses 7 and 8. Then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There's that phrase again. We keep seeing it. Life under the sun. Vanity of vanities under the sun. He says in verse 8, there was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity and it is a grievous task. It is sad to see so many people fit this mold. Maybe even you fit this mold at times. We're surrounded by individuals who spend their entire lives amassing wealth, but they never have any person to share it with. They don't have any loved ones who can have it when they die. After a lifetime of hard, unfulfilling labor, they end up becoming miserly, lonely old men. No dependent, no son, no brother, but there was no end to all of his labor. I think it's an important question we need to ask ourselves. Why am I doing what I'm doing? If it's your job, why are you doing what you're doing? If it's just to get a paycheck, and that's okay, by the way. I think we have a silly, fanciful notion in 2020 in the Western civilized world, right? We have this fanciful notion that if your job is not some rich, rewarding, fulfilling job where you get to be creative and imaginative, then it's not a job worth having. I think that's a silly idea. Sometimes a job is just a job, and that's okay. It is okay to have a job to get a paycheck. Get your bills paid. Take care of your family. Take care of your kids. There's nothing wrong with just working a job because it's a paycheck. So ultimately, the purpose behind that job can't just be because, you like running cable under people's houses, or, you like fixing septic tanks, right? Ultimately, that can't be the thing that keeps you up in the right that makes you wake up in the morning ready to go to your day. But are you doing it for your loved ones? Or are you doing it because you feel a responsibility to society to do something productive and useful? Do you do it to take care of your family? Do you do it so that you have something to share with those who have a need? So that you can practice charity? So that you can give a donation or a contribution to the work of the church? Ephesians chapter 4 makes a statement along these lines. It says in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 27, "Let him who steals steal no longer, but rather let him labor, performing with his own hands what is good, in order that he may have something to share with him who has need." And so whether you do work a really creative, fulfilling, imaginative job, or you just work a job, ultimately you have to ask the question, why am I doing this? The person in verse 8 never asked that question. The person in verse 8 never stopped and asked himself, for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? It's vanity, and it's a grievous task. Let's look at verses 9 through 12 now. Two are better than one, he says. It's interesting. Given everything he's said up to this point, right, he's talked about how in human civilization there's always going to be oppression, right? There will always be powerful people who are oppressing, and there will always be the lowly people who are oppressed, right? There's always oppression in government. He talks about how it would be better to have never existed. If you just live a miserable life, it'd be better to never exist at all. He talks about rivalry and competition, how vain it is. He talks about lonely, miserly old men who work their entire lives for nothing. And yet, even with all of that observed, he can still say, two are better than one. Two people are better than one. Two people are better than one because they have a good return for their labor, he says in verse 9. Verse 10, for if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together to keep warm, you wonder, how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands, he says, is not quickly torn apart. How true these statements are. The field that can be plowed by one man in one day can be plowed in half a day by 2 men. In almost every facet of life, the benefits of teamwork are astounding. There's a rabbinical saying, either friendship or death. Another rabbi once said, a man without friends is like a left hand without the right. And so the preacher proceeds to give a few examples of this concept. If one of them falls, he says in verse 10, his companion will be there to lift him up. But woe to the one who falls when he's by himself. There's a lot of stories out there. And, in survival circles, a lot of stories get passed around about near-death experiences where somebody went out to the wilderness and he didn't bring a phone and he didn't bring a walkie-talkie. He didn't have contact and he didn't leave any information behind. He didn't tell people where he was going. And then a storm happens, or he gets trapped somehow, or he gets injured or attacked by a wild animal. Those are some pretty harrowing experiences. A little bit of teamwork would prevent a lot of those stories from happening. If one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him, he says in verse 12. And a cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. You can take a single strand, and it can hold a certain amount of weight, but it has a breaking point. Take 2 strands and weave them together, and it's doubly strong. Take 3, though, and that's not quickly torn apart. It's all about teamwork. Good practical application, and I know we're just about out of time here, but good practical application is think about what you can accomplish by yourself, and then imagine what can be done with teamwork. Now, that's true in a family, that's true in a business, that's true in society at large, but it's especially true in God's kingdom. God does not call us to be Christians at large. He does not call us to just be Christians as an island, right? Where you become a Christian and you just kind of stand on your own. And I'll deal with Satan and I'll deal with sin and I'll practice charity and I'll worship God, but I'm going to do it all by myself. I don't need other Christians. I don't need to be a part of a church. I don't like organized religion. God does not call us to just be Christians as individuals. We're part of His kingdom. We're part of His holy family. We're part of the structure of His temple, a building of God's. You can't just do that by yourself. And what one Christian can do by himself is pretty amazing. Think about what many Christians working together can accomplish. Now, Solomon closes his chapter with a little parable in verses 13 through 16. A brief discussion of the vanity of royalty and how kings come and go at a whim. He says here in verse 13, "A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king, that king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he is born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with them. For this too is vanity and striving after the wind." He describes a poor yet wise lad. And he says that poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king, because that old king no longer has the desire or the motivation to learn anything new. That old foolish king is set in his ways. That old foolish king only listens to certain people, certain advisors, a certain sect or a part of his kingdom. He's an old foolish king, and people don't trust him anymore. They're looking for the next fresh face. So a poor yet wise lad comes along and impresses everybody. He's young, he's flashy, he's got new, fresh ideas. So what do the people do? They make him king. Of course. Take the young, wise, fresh idea, fresh-faced young man. Let's turn him into the king. Get rid of the old man. Put the new face in there. And for a while, that's fine. But he goes on in verses 15 and 16 to describe the way that that young, wise lad eventually becomes the old, foolish king himself. And what do the people want at that point? Well, they want another one. Give us the next new thing. That's how people are. Now, there's an inherent vanity then in royalty. Doesn't matter where you come from. Doesn't matter who your dad was, who your mom was. The fact is that if enough people in your kingdom come to despise you, and enough people in your kingdom reach a point where they're ready for a replacement, and enough people in your kingdom show up with torches and pitchforks, you're going to get replaced. It doesn't matter if you're the prince or your dad was the king. It doesn't matter what your lineage is. I mean, just ask the royal family during the Russian Revolution. People don't care. You know what people care about? Food. You know what people care about? Taxes. You know what people care about? Getting jobs, working and being productive. Doesn't matter what your lineage is. So Solomon is saying, and I think I don't want to say it's an apology for being royal, but there's this element of like a realization that Solomon has of, doesn't matter who your parents were. If the people want to replace you, they'll replace you. And the moment you become the old foolish king, that young wise lad will show up. Wherever he comes from obscurity or poverty or wherever, that fresh-faced, new ideas, young king is going to show up. And he'll replace you. He surely will. It is vanity to think that royalty means anything in a world of greed and hate and self-interested pursuits. That is why we look to God. We look away from this world, away from the things of this world, and we look to God. God is not empty, God is not vain, and God is not an old foolish king. Now stick with us. We'll be in chapter 5 in our next study. You got to see where this book is going, because I know at this point you're kind of on the edge of, well, this is kind of a discouraging study, isn't it? Does Solomon just have nothing but bad news for us in Ecclesiastes? Well, stick around to chapter 12 to find out. As always, my friends, have a wonderful and blessed day.